Hello. Thank you for joining us today as we discuss restorative practices and social skills. My name is Steph Jensen, and I'm the Director of Community Contracts at Boys Town. Boys Town is a nationally recognized organization with 100 years promoting and providing a continuum of care to build communities and strengthen families. As part of our outreach to communities, we work with schools and districts across the country to work with educators to develop effective strategies to help students develop the social skills that they need to be successful, both academically and socially. It was during one of these engagements that I came to know and collaborate with Dr. Robert Spicer, who's here with us today.
Good afternoon.
I received a call about 10 years ago. At the time, the CEO of Chicago Public Schools had reached out to Boys Town to find out about addressing some of the needs that they had in their high schools. Mr. Duncan, at the time, he was looking to improve test scores. He wanted to improve attendance rates, reduce suspensions and expulsions. Some of those things that I would hear from a lot of superintendents and CEOs, leaders of different districts across the country. But Arnie had one goal that I had never heard before and I haven't heard since. And one of those goals was to reduce the number of murders that were occurring in their high schools, and specifically at Finger High School, where they had had an incident that had made national news. So it's through this work that I came to collaborate with Robert, and we started to see the importance of joining restorative practices with social skills. And so I'll let Robert tell a little bit about himself.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Robert Spicer. I'm with Restorative Strategies, LLC, and I'm so glad to be on this call with all of you and to be here sharing with you this very important work and this very important collaboration. So I'm so glad to be here with Steph Jensen, and she's a dear friend of mine and dear friend of the movement of really bringing restorative measures and restorative practices and the Boys Town education model together to help deal with a very difficult situation. Since that time of being at Finger High School and working with that incredible team, my wife and I decided to start our own limited liability company called Restorative Strategies to begin to spread this work all over the United States, because we found that the schoolhouse to jails pipeline, the violence, the trauma, all the hurt that was going on in schools was not just what was happening in Chicago. This was something that was happening all over the United States of America. And so our mission is to bring this work and to build capacity throughout the many school districts. And currently we're working in Syracuse, New York. We worked in Florida. We've worked, of course, in New York, downstate New York, and, of course, in Illinois and in my hometown of Chicago. I'm originally from New York, born in Brooklyn, raised in Hempstead, Long Island, went to school in Atlanta, Georgia at Morehouse College, and then moved to Chicago, Illinois, where I've been there for over 20 years with my beautiful wife, Chandra, my 4 children, and my 3 dogs. So I'm really happy to be here on this webinar with all of you, and thank you for joining in. And so as we begin to look at what's going on, and as we begin to move the process forward, the whole focus of the work that we've been looking to do is to strengthen communities and empower schools with these practices. Something that we learned firsthand working in Chicago, that without building community and strengthening the community and empowering those schools, there was no way that we were going to be able to reach the most important resource in our school buildings, and that's our children. And so in working in collaboration with Boys Town and their very incredible education model, we began to meld in and bring in these different practices and really focus in on building community within our school districts. Many of you are familiar with Castaway, and you're familiar with Wilson. And I like Wilson because Wilson reminds us that we are social beings, and that without Wilson, the main character, Tom Hanks, would have literally lost his mind. And so the whole use of punitive measures that's been happening has been isolating and disconnecting our young people. And we know that a lot of antisocial behavior will occur if they're not tethered and connected to loving, caring adults that have their best interests and want to encourage them to grow and to progress. And as you know, Wilson helped Tom Hanks. And as you also know, those that were in your lives helped you. So Wilson's an inanimate object, but the people that are in our lives are real. And we want to make sure that the relationships that we build are real, sustainable, and focused on restoration when problems do occur and we do lose connections. And so for the next few minutes, we're going to take you on a journey. We're going to be focusing on designing the these school-wide systems for student success using the Boys and Education model, and as well for setting the stage of how that model, when it was blended in with our multi-tier support systems, our PBIS systems at the school that we were located, as well as the other programs and processes that we were using, how it helped to really build a community, empower the young people, and strengthen their social skills so that they could become the leaders of today, and not wait until tomorrow, but develop them now to become the leaders of tomorrow today. And so we're going to just go quickly through the slides. We're not going to read the slides, but we just want to remind you that there are best practices that are steeped in just what is the right things to do by children and are research-based. And
well, yeah, and you know what's interesting, Robert? I was at a PBIS leadership conference recently, and there's a group of researchers from the University of Connecticut, and they were referencing a study that was first done in Harvard that was looking at the 7 key attributes of successful schools. And what they found those 17 years ago was that 6 of those 7 key attributes for successful schools were around relationship building relationships with kids. And so as they looked at the research and they were trying to replicate the study, they looked at the most recent journal articles, the most recent research publications that have been coming out around successful schools, and found that today, 17 years later, still the top 6 practices for successful schools are around building relationships. But even as directors of a major university teacher college said, they still spend 90% of our time, energy, and resources in preparing teachers on pedagogy, yes, lesson planning, and curriculum. And theory, and only 10% of their time helping them to understand the principles of behavior or how to build relationships. And so, you know, I think we're really at that pivotal time where we have to have the discussion as to how do we build relationships with kids. And I think some of the things that you've seen and we've experienced is these restorative practices alongside teaching skills that really gives teachers the power that they need to be effective as relationship builders.
Absolutely. I think what is so key and so crucial is that relationships are the foundation and the building blocks for a sustainable relationship moving forward. And research study after research study after research study has shown this. And unfortunately, our schools are not implementing this in a way that is really showing positive gains. They're focusing on methodology, pedagogy. They're focusing on curricula, which are important things, but we need to get back to what really works, and that's building those relationships. And that's why we highlighted these best practices for you to review. Some of these best practices, the Voice and Education model has. The first one, the 4-to-1 ratio, 4 positive interactions for every 1 negative. One of the coaches shared with us when I was in the school that we were working at, she used a technique where she would put paper clips in her pocket and she would move them over every time she had done a positive interaction, so that she would be reminded of the fact that it's very important to make sure that if there's one issue in the classroom, that I have to find 4 children that are doing what they're supposed to be doing. Best practices that set the groundwork for building relationship. And so we just wanted to review that with you real quickly. A lot of you may know these, and some of you that don't know them, they're here for you to study and to go through.
So talk about that 4-to-1. Does that mean, I know a lot of people will ask me, and I'm sure you've gotten this question, does that mean I have to give 4 positives to each individual child? Or is that classroom-wide?
It's management, so it's you're finding 4 children in the classroom who are doing what they're supposed to be doing, following instructions, staying focused, as a way of managing, because other children are looking at that negative interaction that you're having with that child, and in their mind, they're like, well, that child is getting the attention. that child is getting the teacher's attention. And most children want attention, whether negative or positive. They just want to be seen, and they want to be heard, and they want to be respected. So when you're finding for other children, what you're telling the other children is, I see you. I see you others following instructions. I see you others using the techniques that I've taught you around study skills. I see you actually doing what you're supposed to be doing, and I want to honor that by giving you a praise or some type of incentive. So it's a way of managing the class. It's also a way of acknowledging that not everybody's acting up. This one child or these two children are acting up, and so I shouldn't then punish the whole class. No, I should find that there are other children that are actually acting as leaders, and then the other children will see that, and they'll begin to follow suit, and they'll want the praise, and it'll absolutely become an avalanche of praise in a positive way while you're still correcting that child who needs that support and help.
Good, good. You want to talk a minute about consequences? I know some of these best practices are around consequences. What was sort of the model that you saw at Finger, and then how did that change?
Well, the beginning was zero tolerance. And for a lot of those that are listening know that zero tolerance is all about control. It's all about punishment. It's focusing on how we can punish you to correct you. And we didn't get the right supports and as well the right gains from the young people when we only use zero tolerance. And we'll go further into that when we do our case study. As we continue on in this webinar. But what we did find out is when we actually began to focus in on mastery of social skills, we began to focus in on specifically looking at young people not as bad children, but as children who have bad habits, who have bad teaching, who have lost their understanding or never received their understanding on social skills. And we realized that it's not anything wrong with them. The only thing that's wrong is that they have not mastered this particular social skills. Then we began to move more toward teaching social skills, and our consequences were focused in on not punishing the child. Our consequences were focused on correcting their behavior and getting them back on track. And that took some time, and we'll talk about that process in a little bit.
And so when you have that basis, you're able to shift kind of from punishing to practicing.
Yes.
There still can be a consequence,
yes.
but part of that consequence was going to be practicing that skill that they so desperately need.
Absolutely. And the consequences can be both positive or negative. And they're age appropriate. And they're focused, and they have and as you see as you read the best practices, they do not last forever. So the child is given an opportunity to have a beginning, a middle, and an end to their consequence as a means of learning from their mistakes, which is what we sometimes don't see happening in our school environments. We sometimes see those old things rehashed over and over again and even used against them when they make newer mistakes. And so we have to show children that once you've made a mistake and once you've been corrected, now we're moving you more toward mastery, and then we understand that school is a place where we want you to make as many mistakes as possible so that you in turn can grow from those mistakes and you can begin to learn from those mistakes and be a leader. And so I have this chessboard because strategy is important, and in order to move from place to place on the chessboard, you know that each piece moves in a different way, and schools are like that. Schools have a lot of moving parts and moving pieces, and once you know the rules of the game, and you know the opportunities and the threats in the process, now you have an opportunity to create a strategy to be able to win and be successful for all the children, the community that you serve, and using the different tools, techniques, and the different guidelines to be able to get from point A to point B where it comes to school. So it's very important that we actually plan and set plans, not only for our academics, but also for our social emotional work. And that's where the Boys in Education model is so incredible in melding it with our multi-tiered support systems in PBIS, because there are plans that are set in place in that process to help us to create strategies that are going to best support the development of our young people.
Yeah, and like you say, having those plans specifically to teaching that social emotional competency. So having to first have the set of skills that you're going to teach, but then you have to have a teaching plan for that. You have to be proactive in teaching those skills, and then you also have to have a plan to praise those skills, to reinforce those skills, to practice those skills, but then also to correct around those skills. So I think you're right. The plan is so important, and for all of us to know what that plan is, so we can move from the philosophical to the practical, where we can support one another and support our students.
And we don't get into the gray area of inconsistency when we actually roll out these plans and these strategies, because when that happens, now you're confusing the young people.
Right.
And they're not going to be able to master these skills. And so our enemy is zero tolerance.
Right.
Clear, and there's no let's sit down and let's talk, because zero tolerance doesn't want to talk. Zero tolerance is that hammer, and you're that nail. And the focus of zero tolerance is to be punitive. And zero tolerance has created a lot of problems in our families, created a lot of problems in our schools, and it's created a lot of problems in our communities, as well as created a lot of problems for our young people in their development. And so we do not feel that zero tolerance has a place in schools because of the nature of the school to jailhouse pipeline, which zero tolerance is literally fed to the point of what we see what's happening in our juvenile centers, what we see what's happening in our streets, what we see what's happening in our detention centers, our adult detention centers. A lot of children who now grow up into adults had their first instance of being connected to the criminal justice system through school and through a mistake that they made. And that mistake then evolving into a criminal offense, which then evolved into corrections. And that has not helped a lot of the communities that have been affected by the zero tolerance policies that have been put in place in the name of trying to make our schools safe.
Mm-hmm. And don't you think zero tolerance is where we're headed if we don't have a plan in the beginning?
Absolutely.
Because I love what you say about feeding the teachers.
Yes, if you don't feed the teachers, they'll eat the children. Dr. Neela Connors wrote a book that is so powerful in looking at the whole notion of making sure that we're feeding our teachers good professional development, feeding our teachers the right opportunities to learn and to grow, because if we don't feed them, the children are going to be the ones that are going to be hurt and harmed by the lack of information. And yes, the default that they will use will be a punitive measure as opposed to a restorative measure. So that's why the teaching comes into place and the strategies come into place, and the plan comes into place. That's so important. There you go. So this is what we are hoping to reach when we're talking about restorative practices, when we're talking about building our multi-tier support systems, our PBS systems, when we're talking about an incredible education model, of the voice and education model. We want to get to the point of building relationships and building community using the restorative practices, understanding that we started out in good relationship, but somewhere along the way, our relationship went through a process of being strained. And so when that happens, when that occurs, there has to be a technique, there has to be ways to bring people back after they've made mistakes. And once we've brought them back into a space of right relationship, now we have to reinforce the social skills that kept us in good relationships in the first place, because somewhere along the way, a relationship was pushed forward. The book that I referenced, someone asked the question, Dr. Neela Connors, and the book is entitled, "If You Don't Feed the Teachers, They Will Eat the Children." Very powerful book, and one that all teachers should, and all educators should definitely get. So the focus is on that. Do you want to, Steph, go into what you shared with me about the C's, the young lady that shared with you the process of consistency, and that I think that would fit very clearly with this slide. It was very powerful.
Understanding that basic child development, Dr. Karen Pittman, who's known as the kind of referred to as the godmother of child development, did a lot of work in urban areas, and she bases her theory on the 5 C's, where first it starts with competence. We have got to give kids the knowledge that they need, both academically and socially, so that they can be successful. So looking at where are their deficits, where are those gaps in competency, in knowledge. Because once you give them the competence, then you can start involving them in opportunities to build confidence. So once they have that knowledge, then they're more willing to take the risks and put that into practice. As they put that into practice and see success, it naturally builds their confidence. And the more reinforcing experiences they have, then the more willing that starts to develop their character. So that confidence then starts to become internalized, and that's how they start to view themselves, which shapes their character. And when that starts to internalize, then they're more willing to make connections, and they're more equipped to connect with others, start developing that network that we all talk about. And as we're looking at social emotional learning, that social awareness, those networks. And once they have that connection, then they're able to contribute. And we know all kids want to contribute. So, looking at those 5 C's, and I think that restorative practices and social skills naturally lend themselves to that because we're always looking at it at a competence level first. What is the skill that you need? We need to stop looking at them as what is wrong with you. It's
Yes.
back to what has happened to you and what can I teach you?
Yes.
And so building that competence, which then develops confidence, which then starts to internalize to your character, how you view yourself, allowing you to make connections, which then allows you to contribute. So
the 5 C's for life, and I wanted Ms. Jensen to put that in because it's just so important to tie in all of the things that we're going to be talking about. So as we go further in our slide, I wanted to just share with you some of the foundations of the work that we're doing. So these are some of the technical things that I want to share with you that are going to help you as you're looking to bring these systems into your, or bring these practices into your schools and into your communities. And so if you look at the 3 circles that are intersecting, the first thing that we have to do, if we're looking at the bottom circle, is we have to delve ourselves or immerse ourselves into the practices that we want to begin to bring in to our school, into our school districts, and to our school communities. Those practices can be a variety of different practices. The practices that we're going to be highlighting in this webinar are the restorative practices and the voice and education model. But there are a variety of Tier 1 interventions that schools can begin to bring in to begin to really build that foundation that are universal. If we're talking about PBIS, universal supports that we can give to all children. Once we have the practices in place, now we can begin to move into the actual data collection. And so now we can actually count what's happening. And we know in education, if it's not counted, it didn't happen. And so we have to make sure that we're collecting data, good, clean data, using a variety of different data systems that are available to us, whether it's Google spreadsheets, whether it's Excel, a variety of different ways where we're able to actually graph and actually measure the movement, measure what we're doing and how we're doing it, and see if we're doing the right things. And then from there, we have to look at the actual systems that we have in place. The data collection is going to help us. This is going to help us to actually evaluate if the systems are actually working. So for instance, how are we moving a child from point A to point B? How are we, in terms of moving that child from the dean's office into a peace room where that child can get a restorative measure? And what do those systems look like? Something that Boys Town did for us that was so incredible is that they gave us cards with all of the different social skills. And so we created a system that when a young person moved from the classroom where they were being sent to a reset space or sent to the peace room, that security officer was working with that young person on their skills. And that was a system to allow for the security officer to have a security guard that we changed the name to security guides, to have that conversation with that young person about what skills you're deficient in and not how bad you are and how you made a mistake. And then if you see the overarching circle, you see the word outcomes. And the outcomes are just so important. So after we've looked at our systems, after we've looked at our practices, after we've looked at and evaluated our data, what are the outcomes? What has happened over the course of 3 months? What has happened over the course of 6 months? What has happened over the course of the full 180 days? And how do we reset? How do we regroup? How do we also reflect upon our practice? If we are saying that we want to be a restorative school district or restorative school or restorative classroom, all of those things are tied into these systems, data, practices that we want to actually put forth as we build these systems in our schools. And so we're going to go through a case study. This is where I got to meet Steph Jensen because she came to Finger and helped us during a very tumultuous time. Christian Finger High School was deemed a turnaround school in Chicago in around 2009. And with that being said, the school was reset. So we had new staff, we had new students that were brought in from another community that were brought into Finger, and a new principal, Elizabeth Dozier. And when all of these new things were put in place, the whole focus was to actually reset the school, because looking at the school's report card over the years, all of the main metrics were down: reading, math scores, and then, of course, the other main metrics of behavior, violence was up. And so they figured that resetting the school, giving them resources, giving them supports will allow for that to happen. And on September 24, 2009, a young man by the name of Darian Albert was killed after a fight that happened in the school, and then it went out into the community. And the young man was beaten by other students. That particular incident was filmed, videoed, and what it did was that it put us in the political spotlight because there was the time of the election of Barack Obama and his family to the White House. And so all of that created even more trauma for our young people, seeing themselves on the 10 o'clock news, being talked about in a very negative way. And so our school morale was pushed down to a very low space. And so we began to do some changes, and we began to create some things that were very important to actually set our children and our school community up for success. And so we want to share that with you as we go forward, and then we prepare to move into the next part.
Now, I think, too, as we paint a picture, we know what happened there in September. But as we look at the broader picture and some of the specifics when we came in and started this work and started the strategy and started the plan, there were some things that we couldn't change. We could not change the socioeconomic status of the students at Finger High School. We could not change the neighborhoods that those students had to walk through to get to Finger High School. We could not change the fact that only 17% of the parents of Finger High School students had ever graduated from high school themselves. We couldn't change the living environment for the students at Finger High School. We could not change the cultural makeup of the students at Finger High School. The only thing that we could hope to change were the attitudes, behaviors, beliefs of the adults at Finger High School. And that was a huge shift because this also, we put this into perspective, Finger had 26 school resource officers that reported directly to Liz Dozier, the principal, and she had 3 Chicago police officers that were on call. So at any given time, you could have up to 29 school resource officers on campus. But with that, it still did not make that a safer campus. It still went back to the attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors of the adults. So bring us to that point. What was the plan?
Well,
what happened?
we're gonna take you right through. So before we do that, we want to get your mind in a thinking of what actually happened to me, and then how that then turned into a transformation. So when I started at Christian Finger High School, when I met the Boys Town team and staff, I was the chief dean. I was a dean. So the dean's role was to be punitive, right? But they knew when they hired me that I also understood and knew restorative practices. So they wanted that to actually happen in our school, but didn't know how to do it. And so during the following year, the beginning of the new school year, there was a decision to shift my role from being the chief dean for restorative justice, code switching, and discipline to the culture and climate coordinator. And so when that shift occurred, the first thing I had to realize was, what does a culture and climate coordinator do in a public high school? So the first thing I had to realize was that culture in a school, the culture of a school is what we practice, what we promote, and what we permit, going back to what Steph just said. And so how are we creating spaces where we can practice, promote, and permit a restorative environment for our students, staff, and community? What are the things that we're going to begin to do? And we know that with culture, when we're talking about what we practice, what we promote, and what we permit, we know that also affects the way in which our climate actually occurs in our school building, how our school the overall feel of our school. Nicole Hayes, who's the director of culture and climate in Syracuse City School District, always says this, and that a school's culture determines its climate. See, what we were doing initially, Steph, is that we were focusing solely on climate, right? The 26 police officers, the SROs, the security officers, the teachers, the staff, all these adults in the building, we got it wrong. Because when we focused only on climate, we were not focusing on what we practice, promote, and permit. We're just focusing on how do we make the school feel safe. And so we figured, the adults in the building figured that using zero tolerance was going to be that way. And we were dead wrong. We were dead wrong. And so when we began to change our thinking and focus mostly on culture, that became my work. That became the work of the culture and climate coordinator with the help of the Boys Town team and so many others to begin the process of rebuilding relationships and really moving our school community to a restorative school community.
So that's a nice title, but I like the title that one of the students gave you.
Oh yeah. So I had a incident where a young person came to me, and he found out that I was a dean still, but he wanted to know what type of dean I was. So he asked me. He said, "Dean Spicer, I hear you're a dean, but what type of dean are you?" And I said, "Well, I'm the dean of peace." And he kind of looked at me like, "The dean of peace? What's that?" And I said, "Well, you'll find out," because we were building it as we were flying it. A lot of you are familiar with the response to intervention, the RTI model, and on your right is the actual theory of what we're supposed to do. 80 to 90% of our Tier 1 responses should focus in on the universal support for our children. Then those that they don't respond, we move them up to the second tier, and then those that don't respond to the second tier, we move them to the third tier. And as we look on the right, this is what we were doing at Finger. We were focusing mostly on the third tier, and the reason why is because we had very traumatized young people at Finger. And so all of our resources were put more toward Tier 3 responses and not more toward Tier 1 responses or Tier 2. Most of our energy was put toward dealing with traumatized young people because they were traumatized by the events that occurred on September 24th, 2009, and even the aftermath of that. And so we began to shift our approach, which is what Steph just said. As adults, we began to shift our approach, and my role was to lead the school to seeing how they can, what's possible, and seeing how they can move into a restorative process. And so the first thing that we decided to do is we decided to create a peace room. First, we created the position, and then we created a peace room where all of our restorative and Boys Town measures were done. That peace room was my office, and so there was already a preset circle already there waiting for the young people. There was a space for our peer council so that they were able to sit and they were able to support other youth when they needed help, and there were also other areas where in the office we were able to have those one-on-one conversations with young people to reset them, the sort of chats as we call them. And from there, the different practices, the sort of conferences, family group conferencing, and peace circles were utilized. Our peer ambassadors, those were our young people who actually were my eyes and ears of the building. So when issues and incidences were going on in fourth period, one of them would come down during the time when they were moving to fifth period and let me know, and then I was able to catch that young person or persons before they were able to go in the lunchroom and do some of the things that they wanted to do. A lot of times our young people just needed to know that people were hearing them and giving them a place where they were seen and not just children that just come and we just know them by just their name, but we actually got to learn about them through the storytelling that they shared with us when we had the opportunity to sit in circle. And that's thanks to the support that our senior leadership gave us to use as much time as we needed to develop those social skills and to prepare them to go back to class. And of course, as you see, the Boys Town Education model, the coaching and supporting teachers, which Ms. Jensen just shared was so eloquently, in our social-emotional curricula that we created around the Boys Town Education model, as well as the PBIS, multi-tier support systems, and of course, restorative measures. So that's just a picture of the peace room and what it looked like. You can make your peace room into any peace room you want, but it's a space where you have the opportunity to actually sit and talk to young people in a communal and indigenous format, using a talking piece and giving every young person the opportunity to have their say and to be heard in a positive and respectful way. And so the peace room was very integral in really giving the young people an opportunity to have a space where they can be reset, they can talk, they can share, they can cry, they can be safe from the things that they were dealing with. And as we just shared with you, Finger is a high school. So you're talking about adolescents who are already going through their own changes in their adolescent years, but put on top of that, adverse childhood experiences, put on top of that, the trauma that the young people were dealing with, put on top of that, the stresses that cortisone presented to the young people and gave to them. And so you have a mixed bag of so many different things that are coming into this peace rooms and other spaces in the building, and carrying adults that understood how to use the Boys Town Education model and how to use restorative measures and restorative practices was so key and important. Room to put on the break. Yes, and so we made an analogy. We talked about the fact that our the circles and using the peace circles was a way to slow things down and to allow for young people to not have to feel so rushed to actually come to a solution to a particular problem or issue, but to have an opportunity to be able to slow things down and to allow them to pump the brakes and slow down. What often happens is that we have these vehicles that we want to use, but they don't have tires. They don't have transmission. You don't even have the key to start the car, to move forward. And we realized that that was zero tolerance. We had a vehicle, but it wasn't getting us the outcomes that we really wanted in our school and our school community. And so we had to pump the brakes and have to begin to slow things down and actually have an opportunity for reflection and an opportunity to think as young people were expressing their feelings and expressing their joys, concerns, and needed help.
Yeah, and for the adults too, because otherwise
Absolutely.
It's like the two drag racers, at the starting line,
Yes.
And we're in the middle of conflict, and the student pushes on the acceleration, and the teacher accelerates more and accelerates, and that acceleration leads to explosion. And so having that peace room was a place for both of them
Yes.
to tap on the brakes, right? So sometimes you might have students that are ready to talk, but teachers that are in a space because there's secondary trauma going on with our staff.
Exactly.
So giving them the time to be able to tap the brakes and have that space really allows for restoration to take place.
Yes, yes, and it's so important that we also give our teachers a space and our adults a space, and we often did a lot of adult circles. We did adult to, of course, student circles. We even did some circles with administration and adults, and parents, which was so important in ensuring that everybody had a voice. So this wasn't just something for the young people or for the young people that were tier 3, but this was something that was universal for every single child that we felt needed a space and needed to be heard and needed to know that there were caring adults that were willing to listen to them. The most powerful medicine that the young people were able to experience was to actually sit in a space where they weren't judged by the adults that were surrounding them, but they were actually being heard and they were respected for what they had to say.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's an important thing to understand is that restorative practice isn't something that we just do in one room.
Yes.
Restorative practices isn't something that we do. Restorative practices has to become who we are.
Yes. And the beauty of code switching is that we want what's happening in the peace room to then translate in the lunchroom, in the classrooms, in the common areas in the building,
To the neighborhood.
and so to the neighborhoods, exactly, to the streets.
Yeah.
And so all the things that Steph had said earlier that we couldn't change, or that we came into that we knew we couldn't really have an effect upon, we also knew that there was potential for having that effect once we were able to build that community, and that young people, as they say, stay woke, right, will begin to wake up, and adults will begin to wake up and begin to really connect with the school, not as just a place of higher learning, but also as a peace hub, a place where they can come and they can actually resolve matters that wouldn't result in gun violence, which is a huge problem in our neighborhoods in Chicago and probably in some of your neighborhoods as well. And so we wanted to see our schools as a place of peace that can translate out into the community and affect the surrounding communities that the schools were in. These next few slides are going to be focusing on data, and we're not going to stay too long on them, but we just want to just share with you some of the effects of what we were doing in the school, how the restorative measures were working and supporting that, how the voice and education model was doing that. Of course, the bread and butter is attendance. And so as you can see, from 2010 when we started to where we were beginning to move forward in our 4-year trajectory, we see that we have a steady growth in attendance. So the stopping of suspension and expelling and arresting our children at the high rates we were doing and beginning to really fold in these practices, the children wanted to be there.
Yeah, and so did the staff.
Right. The staff. Well, I don't have that graph, but yes, staff were definitely there because the children came because of 1 or 2 adults in the building. And that support and that love and that encouragement encouraged them to now not only come to school, but then to get engaged in extracurricular activities and other community service opportunities, which we'll talk about in the next further slides. As you can see, in terms of our serious misconducts per 100 students, we had a student population of about 1,200 with the folding in of the other community and the other young people in our school community. And as you can see, a significant drop from 2010 to 2011. And a lot of that drop had to do with the fact that we were building those relationships with those young people that were gang involved, those young people that were transient, those young people that were dealing with trauma that was just incredible. We were able to place them in spaces where they were able to get the help they needed, but also our school began to shift in its approach to them, which then resulted in the reduction in our serious misconducts. And that's based on our student code of conduct for the Chicago Public Schools. And our number of violent misconduct, if you're just counting the violent misconduct, fights, mob actions, the higher tier disciplinary actions, as you can see, a gradual reduction until by the time we got to 2013, 89 incidences had occurred that were violent misconducts. And most of those violent misconducts happened from children that we knew had some real serious trauma and real serious issues that were going on with them. We already given them supports and help that they needed. And it wasn't always suspension, expulsion, and arrest. Some of those supports resulted in them getting some restorative measures, some Boys Town activities, and building of social skills, so that they in turn wouldn't make the same mistakes again as they move forward in their academics and their career.
Yes, I think this is also where we saw a huge shift in the involvement of the SROs.
Yes.
And being the front line. So, when we first started, it was a lot of yelling. It was a lot of,
Absolutely.
move, a lot of just noise. And then as we started to shift to more restorative practices and social skills combined,
yes,
we saw a complete shift in the utilization of those SROs. You want to talk a little bit about how they became kind of that front line of defense?
Absolutely. Our SROs, and for those that don't know, SROs were our police officers. They were actual Chicago police officers. We had two of them. The first two really didn't connect really well with the young people. And that room, that was a police room where they could be booked and they could be arrested, really was an arm of the legal system, of the criminal justice system. And we knew that that's not the type of school that we wanted to have. We didn't want to have a school where we were widening the net to have young people who did just stupid stuff that young people do as adolescents, stuff that they're not thinking about, that can then turn into a criminal act, which can then result in their arrest and their removal from school. And so we had new officers that were placed in our school who were very connected with what we were doing in terms of our social emotional curriculum and our Boys Town and our restorative work. So much so that they were encouraging it and wanted to see more of that done, and just wanted to just be there as a support to what was going on in the school building. And that definitely set a tone for how we were going to interact with our young people and the families that were connected to us at our school. And so that relationship really helped me and really helped a lot of the other adults shift their thinking about how SROs can be used in schools, that they can be used as a support, they can be used as a resource. When there are issues, when it's a criminal offense, and they have to be a part of it, the way that they talk to the young person, the way that they showed compassion to the young person, really set a tone, set a message of how important it is for us to create a restorative mindset for policing, a restorative strategy for policing, and how we can actually humanize those that are being put in a place where they have to actually interact with the police. And so it was very, very important to actually help see their evolution and see how we can begin to work together as opposed to working adversarially when it came to law enforcement in schools.
Yeah, and the conversations that would take place when kids were sent out of the classroom and they come straight to the SRO out in the hallway, and how those conversations would sound differently than they had when they started.
Way differently. And I'm a proponent that, I don't want any connection of the criminal justice system in schools. I don't think that there should be SROs in schools. I think there's enough adults in school buildings to handle and to work with the young people in the building. But in certain cases, like our case, that's why there's a case study, we did have that because we had very traumatized and very angry young people. And so they were there to also support us as we were doing our work. But we realized that it wasn't just enough to just have police in the building. We had to have relationship. And so that was the focus. How do we build those relationships with our students, our staff, and the community at large? How do we make sure that we maintain those relationships? So if they do have interaction with the police in the community, the same police that, same SROs that were in the school building, that it's a positive relationship. They know their name. They can say, hey, that's John. Come here, John. Let me talk. What's going on? You okay? Can I help you? You can see them more as a resource as opposed to an adversarial entity in our community.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was something that we wanted to make sure that happened because we all were sharing this space.
Yeah.
And this was the reality of what was going on at our school.
Well, and I saw that a lot, around those skills when they started using that skill language. So you'd see the SROs greeting students in the hallway.
Yes.
Instead of yelling down the hallways, they're now greeting kids and talking with kids. And when kids get sit out of the classroom and they say, hey, what are you doing out here?
Yes.
Say, well, I wasn't following instructions.
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah.
Let's practice that.
Because, of course, it's to their benefit
Yeah.
that you get the skills in school. Because if you don't get the skills in school, you're going to end up on the wrong side of their relationship. And so they wanted to make sure that those relationships in the school building were clear and that everybody was able to get the best benefit of the education they were receiving at Finger High School, from social skills to academics as well.
Yeah, those restorative practices along with the specific skills helped to really shift those. You went from being confrontational, from having a confrontation to having a conversation.
Yes.
Completely shifted that climate.
And this is something that's going on in Chicago right now where we're trying to figure out how to integrate community policing back into our communities so that it's not an adversarial situation that we're having where police and the community at large are not able to work together to deal with criminal behavior that is having an adverse effect on so many families in our city and in a lot of parts of our United States. And so that's a bigger, larger question and probably another webinar. But for this webinar, we're going to continue on with what's going on. And so this particular slide looks at on-track data in the high schools. When you're looking at young people, the focus is that all of our young people, when they finish freshman year, should have all of their credits. And those that have all their credits are on track to graduate in 4 years. And what we found pre-turnaround is that we only had 46.9% on track. That meant that we had well over 50% of our young people that were not on track, which meant that they wouldn't be successful in graduating in 4 years, and they would end up either sucked into the prison industrial complex or sucked into the gangs or inevitably killed by guns or be a shooter in the community. And so the focus became very, very clear that we had to make sure that every single freshman will be on track. And as you can see, based upon the work that our freshman counselor, Ms. Kim Hunter Bradley, was doing at our school and all the other entities that work together at Finger, the focus became freshmen on track. And as you can see by the data, we were able to bump it up to well over 70%. And so that meant that the focus was how do we begin to continue that work so that when we have young people that are now 5-year seniors, we can in turn make sure that they have their credits and they were able to then graduate. And as you can see, there's a bump in our 5-year graduation rate because of our focus in ensuring to let those young people know, even though you didn't do well in your freshman year or your sophomore year, you still have a chance to get the credits. And so we had a lot of credit recovery programs that were given and supported our young people so they were able to graduate in the 5 years. Next slide is very exciting because now we're looking at college enrollment. So you're looking at generational wealth and generational shift in education in families who have never may have never had an individual graduate from high school, much less now into the college realm. And I want to tell you that in June of 2017, Finger High School had 100% graduation rate. First time that school in its history had ever had all of its seniors graduate at 100% and receiving well over $2 million in scholarships. And so you're talking about young people that are now given an opportunity to now grow and to move into a level where now they're able to destroy poverty, they're able to move into the middle class, they're able to become job creators if they want to become entrepreneurs, they're career ready, and they're ready to actually change the world for the better. This slide just adds more to our data conversation and looking at the actual practices disaggregated and then looking at the actual results. Semester 2011 and 2012 just shows a significant shift. Before that was all Robert Spicer. That was me doing a lot of those trainings and a lot of that work. When we move into the first semester of 2012, you're looking at the teachers now and the adults, the security officers, and everybody taking on more of the restorative conferencing and actually using those models to help support, using the Boys Town Education model to actually reinforce social skills. So it became not just Robert Spicer, Culture and Climate Coordinator, but it became whole school approach, and that this was something that all of us in our school should take stock in. That's where you started to see the buy-in, and people started seeing the results of what we were doing and how it's creating a pathway from young people that were coming into our school and not finishing to a pathway to success, not only in social skills, but also in academics. And so this is where we want to get to. We want to move our young people from the cradle to college and beyond. There's a young man who came to us during those very tumultuous years, and I'm so proud of him because there he is holding his diploma, and he is ready to move into the world of college and the world of life. And I'm just really excited when we're able to see our young people move to that level of becoming young men and young ladies of distinction, and young men and young ladies that are going to be able to take these skills that we've taught them over the 4 years.
And the confidence.
And right? They're the things that we shared and we talked about so that they can be successful in the work that they're doing. These were the 2 skills that we really focused on at our school because our children had a tough time listening and they had a tough time following instructions. And so we really, really honed in on these social skills and ensuring that our young people were able to master these social skills. And what's beautiful about the Boys Town Education model and the blending of restorative measures is the fact that these social skills were able to be reinforced after we had done a circle or after we had done a restorative measure. So it wasn't a competition between Boys Town and restorative measures and restorative practices, but it was a actual blending of these 2 practices as a universal support to reinforce the whole notion that young people are not bad. Young people have developed bad habits, and that those bad habits can actually be turned into good habits by constant reinforcement and building of character and building of skills. This slide just reinforces the fact that as we were putting in the restorative actions and we were dealing with most of the high-end misconducts, we saw a reduction in the zero tolerance ways in which we were focusing on young people, and we saw an elevation of the restorative actions as we move forward. Remember, data is king, so we had to collect data to ensure that our argument was clear. In terms of our misconducts resulting in suspensions, 2010 when we first got it, half the children, right? Every time they came to the dean, 1 out of 2 children's staff were being pushed out. Yeah. And some of them were good kids. That, all kids are good, but some of them were kids that were more well connected, if you want to just say that were doing, the right things, but just made a bad error, bad choice. Mm-hmm. And as we moved down to 2013, little over 15%. So 85% of our children had the opportunities that were afforded them to actually receive these social skills and these measures, which resulted in the teachers being able to teach, the students being able to learn, and we as a school community being able to be a learning community. This slide just looks at the disaggregated data again of the different measures that we were using, the restorative practices that we were using, and how they were having an impact. 2011, 2010, that was all mostly me and some of the young people that were helping me. But as you can see, the restorative conferencing became real clear. Something that was very important to our senior leadership and to others to ensure that they were having these conversations with young people, and these conversations were not punitive, but they were restorative. They were helping young people to be able to get back on track, to reset, and to move into a direction that was going to help them to become successful in the work that they were doing. And so these next slides are just basically the community service arm of the work. It's so important that we focus in on community service. And the previous slide, the slide before, we can go back real quickly, that was our first peace rally. And the focus of those rallies were focusing on really school-wide opportunities to bring young people and adults together in a positive way. Then from there, we began to look at the moving of our school community outside of the walls, and we had Peace Week and Peace Month, balloon release events that were focused in on that. Then we began to look at how we can move out into the community and actually have marches where we can actually show the school community that we weren't a school of violence, but that we were a school of peace, and to actually connect what we were doing to historical marches that were done to actually bring a message to America in terms of the injustice, but also to talk about and celebrate the great things that we were doing. And these were some of the great results that we started to see in terms of the increase in our attendance, dropout rate, definitely very important metric. Freshmen on track going up 48.5%. Misconduct, of course, dropping by 80%. It's one of my favorites. And all of our young people now getting connected now to an after-school activity, which gave them something to do that was positive.
Excellent.
And so the different focuses that we had was to also know how to pass the baton to our young people, because this couldn't just be adult-led. This had to be student-led. And so that was where our peer ambassadors came into play, and they were so important and so integral in the well-being of our school, because our young people wanted to ensure that they had a successful high school experience, but they couldn't do that if they were always focusing on fighting and violence and dealing with conflicts in a negative way. So the passing of the baton was so important, and that's where we created our Peer Ambassadors Club, and we focused very much on them being able to help restore and repair harm that was going on with their own peers. And it was very successful for the young people and for the school as well. And now the climate began to shift in a positive way, because now the young people saw and owned, right? They owned their experience. It wasn't just me as an adult telling them what to do, but it was them as a school community and the young people saying, these are the things that we want to do moving forward. And so the peer council was very integral and very important to the well-being of our young people, and it really helped to get the young people involved in the discipline processes that were going on, and using restorative measures as that vehicle that had wheels, brakes, transmission, and most importantly, had a key, so that we can unlock these doors and we can build these relationships with these young people.
Yeah. Well, Robert, thank you so much for sharing this experience. You know, really started with that plan, started with that strategy, laying out how this was all done, and ending with that beautiful message of when it starts to seep into it's what the kids do, you know that you've affected the climate, and in turn had a huge impact on the community. Thank you for all the work that you've done and the work that you continue to do.
Thank you.
If you are interested, or if you have any questions or would like any more information, you can reach out to Robert or myself. We'd be happy to continue the conversation. It's an important conversation that we need to keep having as educators.
Absolutely. Thank you all for your comments, and we'll continue to support the great work that all of you are doing. And remember, if you don't feed the teachers, they will eat the children. Thank you so much for being a part of this webinar.